Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor.
The news continues, and there seems to be a lot of economics in it, as well as politics,
Yes.
and a lot of pessimism. And it occurred to me reading these recent reports on the World Economic Forum and on what's going on in Washington and the US economy, that the people who are pessimistic about the future and say that maybe the US economy is heading in the same direction as Japan's has been heading in the last 20 years, are pessimistic because they're interpreting the present in terms of the past and are not thinking in terms of a trajectory that is aiming to towards something different. That is, they're not paying enough attention to the way everything in our society is going through a crucial phase of qualitative change. And I was trying to work out today how to put this on a longer term trajectory so that it would be clearer. And this is what came to my mind, that generally, since the Enlightenment and since we've begun to think in terms of party politics as an interpretation of the ideas of the Enlightenment and the way we run the society politically, there's been a divide in the political parties between the conservatives who want to hold on to things as they used to be, usually in which usually the people with vested interests are particularly well represented. And the other side are the progressives who want to design society so that it improves. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've got two-party systems here and in some other countries, especially Anglo-Saxon countries, which are very easily identified with the conservatives and the progressives. And in some cases, they're more conservative. In some cases, they're more progressive. But that works okay as long as things don't change too fast. And in the last 50 years, I think the rate of change has been increasing to the point that it's difficult to be a real conservative anymore. As I thought about this, Daniel Patrick Moynihan came to mind, and I'm not sure whether I may have said this before, that one of the letters he wrote that was in this enormous book of letters that's just been published, paid attention to the fact that so many things worked politically in New York City in particular, but in the country in general as well, in the 1960s. He wrote this to President Nixon, I think, because the majority of the population subscribed to traditional norms of behavior, traditional moralities. And so certain things were taken for granted that meant that what was actually negotiated politically was a smaller amount of the total of what has to be done from day to day. And of course, those moral givens have gradually been changing. And if one's a conservative, one could say that they're changing for the worse, or they're disappearing altogether and we're becoming an immoral society. But I think that's the sort of evaluation that doesn't really get us anywhere. They've been changing. And so we can't depend on those anymore. So much more has to be negotiated politically in the society now than had to be negotiated before. And I think that's the basis of the qualitative change.
I don't disagree with you, actually. I met Pat Moynihan a number of times when I worked in Washington for then Congressman Florio. In fact, I had a little bit of a relationship with him through a completely non-governmental outlet, which I'll tell you the next time we have lunch. But it's very interesting because you referenced a couple of reports, specifically the pre-Davos agenda-setting report from the World Economic Forum that came out today, which was incredibly gloomy. The article that Fareed Zakaria wrote for Foreign Affairs, which also was equally as gloomy. And then today, just to pour more fuel on the fire, on page 3 or 4 of the New York Times was an article about life expectancy in the United States under the age of 50 is actually dropping precipitously. So when you look at all this, it looks absolutely terrible. But I had never conflated the bad news with the two-party system role. But when you think about it, if one is a progressive and looks at all of this news, albeit gloomy as it is, it presents itself as an opportunity. You can look at it and go, well, all right, there's an awful lot that now can be done. There are things that can be fixed. There are things that can be tackled and challenges, etc. But if you come at this as a conservative, um, unfortunately, unfortunately, the initial hope that I am a progressive would have, that their view would be, well, we need to go back to basics and we need to let things stay as they are. But it's not the case now. They've become active conservatives, and that their view is that they need to go all the way back and eliminate taxation, eliminate governmental services, eliminate the infrastructure and the safety nets, et cetera, that exist, which I think would only serve to exacerbate the problem right now. As Zakaria points out, and as it's in between the lines of the World Economic Forum report, and certainly it's there in black and white if you're reading the mortality and morbidity report compiled by the government. I mean, people are dying because there are too many guns, because of alcohol abuse, because of people not wearing seatbelts, and people not wearing helmets while riding motorcycles. I mean, that's like pretty stark, but yet if you're a strict libertarian or perhaps a Tea Party person believing in no regulation or laws, those things are all fine. And I do think, after reflecting on this, that the situation is going to become so bad that what will have to happen is that even the most dyed-in-the-wool conservatives will recognize that these issues have to be addressed, and it's going to develop into some sort of a consensus, and people will have to work together, much as Moynihan outlined in that letter. And these days, even if it's a small achievement to be able to work together to find common ground, that would be a seminal event.
Well, let me see if I can go further to starve your pessimism and feed your optimism.
All right.
I think that the serious divide in the Republican Party in this country is to some extent due to this problem, that there are some people who just cannot give up the idea of holding on to the past, idealizing the past that they can't remember, because some of them are too young to remember.
Yes, yes.
And after all, the past is getting further and further away. And a larger part of the Republican Party is becoming much more pragmatic, which is what Americans are supposed to be anyway, like the Tories in England, who were, most of the Tories in England are no longer really Tories. I mean, they've already changed enormously, so that you can't really tell that much difference between David Cameron's policies and Tony Blair's policies. But so much more has to be negotiated and changed to keep up with things, and the countries in which negotiation and change is structurally easier are doing much better. And the big problem with America, apart from the fact that the items that you mentioned, people refusing to wear or not wearing crash helmets and that sort of thing. The point is that it's so difficult to change anything that's in writing. Mm-hmm. You've got this structure in writing. Another thing that will help us understand this, I think, that I heard this morning on the BBC World News, was that in Denmark, which has one of the best state welfare systems in the world, where the state looks after your child from the age of 1 onwards so that you can go to work, and excellent healthcare system and so on, is beginning to get to the point, and after all, the economic situation in Denmark is not that bad at the moment compared to the rest of Europe, but is beginning to get to the point where they can't see how they're going to maintain the state welfare system that they have got used to. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are these problems on the other side of the as well. And that means that it's becoming more and more difficult to maintain this traditional divide that we've had for essentially 300 years, although it's obviously been growing all that time.
Well, tell me a country or two that that you would view as being modestly well equipped to be able to handle these changes that you referred to at the beginning, rather than have to legislate things out that have already been reduced to
Well, I
written
think
laws.
that I mean what everybody looked to America for as being ideal was the separation of powers and the protection of minority interests.
Mm-hmm.
Make that in a system that made it very difficult for the majority to dominate the minority. It wasn't impossible, of course, but it was more difficult than it was in most countries.
Mm-hmm.
As distinct from the sort of system that one has in England, but also I think in Australia and Canada,
Mm-hmm.
in which you can say that the government is a 5-year dictatorship. The government's in power and do more or less what it likes. And then if people don't like it, they'll vote it out. And they can vote it out, in fact, before the 5 years are up.
I see. Because right now in the United States, I mean, to paraphrase Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
It's like, why did we have the election?
Yeah.
I mean, we're right back at this.
But the amazing thing is that the public, and I think this was in one of the articles looking at earlier on, the public voted back in exactly the system that had been the problem before.
Right, right.
If you look at the other European democracies also, the provisions that were made for this country's system, which were so good at the time and so good for a certain degree of change, don't seem to be working for change at the rate that we've got into now.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the other systems seem to be more flexible.
Mm-hmm.
However, the welfare state, which is part of what has come out of the efforts to redesign society, where the conservative forces were not so strong, now is beginning to look very vulnerable, simply because it's built on assumptions that we can't maintain.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because sometimes I wonder whether or not the people are ahead of the politicians already and have sort of addressed the problem themselves. But then as I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that, I mean, this is really nothing more in some respects than bread and circuses all the way back to the Romans. You have, because of the ability now with the communication development in the world, you have this alternative reality universe that exists where people sit at home and watch television that are so-called quote-unquote reality TV shows about other people's lives because they're reluctant to live their own lives. They become voyeurs. You have this plethora of computer animation games in which young people are engaged in all sorts of violent and sexually depraved activities in the confines of their own bedrooms on laptop computers. You have the burgeoning sports industry now that's compounded upon by the advertising campaigns and 24-hour sports TV and sports radio channels. And it's almost as if the population as a whole has said, all right, yeah, we understand there are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security problems. We understand there are economic problems, but just forget all that. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to devote my conscious time where I could be productive and helping and doing whatever a normal Cincinnatus kind of citizen would do in the old days. I'm just going to beam out, as they would say on Star Trek, and just check out and get involved in something else. And this is the downside, I think, to this globalization debate, in that, yes, it can create all this new means of communication, but it also affords such individual freedom for people to be able to avoid their responsibilities. And I'm using that word responsibilities in a very broad sense.
What you just said is extremely interesting, because, and I would like to add to it the fact that a declining proportion of the population is bothering to vote.
Of course.
Which means that the democracy is beginning to depend upon different sorts of people from what it depended on before. It's more and more difficult to define labor in relation to other parts of the population because of the way ownership is being redistributed.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, what we think of as what we have thought of as democracy, the way our thinking about democracy has been conditioned over the last 100 years, has to change. Australia tries to stop it from changing by fining people who don't vote. Voting is compulsory.
Really?
Yeah. That is, so far as I know, Australia is the only country that has done that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many people they have to fine every time, but I know they do deal out fines every time. And maybe that would solve the problem, but I suspect that would not solve the problem. People just wouldn't, they do it because they had to do it to avoid the fine, but they wouldn't do it in the way they're supposed to do it, and that you can't do anything about. What I get out of this discussion that we've had today is one that more and more things are up for negotiation all the time. Therefore getting into the political arena, things are getting into the political arena that didn't get into it before. And the participation in the political arena is changing, both in terms of who finances the elections and who bothers to vote in the elections and organize the voting. And the combination of these two changes is going to produce an enormous qualitative change in the way society works.
Well, you brought up the Enlightenment. So if you brought that up, let me posit this. If Max Weber's view of the Enlightenment was advanced to the current view today, with the work ethic and the morals and the traditions of the strict Protestantism that he attributed a lot of the source seeds, the seed fruits, if you will, of the Enlightenment insofar as the formation of the Western economies and the Western work structure goes. I mean, it's almost as if we've forgotten all that. And it's almost as if that kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, that kind of grounding is lost. And I don't know what the answer is. That to me, I mean, if you were to draw some sort of common denominator between all of these problems that have been articulated by the World Economic Forum, by Fareed Zakaria, and by the decline in life expectancy and all that, I mean, that would be one of the main roots, common denominator, in that they don't have this grounding anymore that forced people on sailing ships to leave England and to come to the United States and to begin to create new lives, that had those convicts in Australia turn from being convicts to being people who recognize that, man, this is a good opportunity here. We can do something here.
But I wonder what proportion of the population they were at that time that we actually that actually left records for us so that we can think of that period in that way.
I don't know.
And what proportion of people now, whether the proportion of people now who are adventurous, entrepreneurs, innovators, investors, whether it's very different. I certainly, with what I do here in the university, am amazed at the quality of the minds that I deal with, people who are just coming in from high school. Which has certainly improved a great deal over the last 30 or 40 years. So I hope I've convinced you that there's a road to optimism.
I'm feeling better. All right. All right. Thank you very much, Professor. See you next week. Bye.